Why is it that the religious have a really hard time actually talking to atheists? Mostly because they have nothing intelligent to say. I keep seeing the religious complain, but you're mean, because we don't take their asinine nonsense seriously. But this isn't about being mean, it's about holding to objective reality, and the religious want very little to do with that. So, with that aside, let's get back to it. Welcome back to part 2 of How to Talk to Atheists with Clarity and Confidence. And if you saw the first part, this isn't about how to talk to actual, real, live atheists. It's about how to make a complete fool of yourself and pander to other theists. And that's pretty typical behavior because up against an actual, well-educated atheist, most theists are just toast. They don't actually know nothing. Therefore, they play these silly make-believe games and say, well, we're all gonna win, even though anyone who tries just looks silly because these claims and arguments are just dumb. But let's see where this goes next. There's supposedly a big example coming up, and we don't want to miss that, do we? Evidence for God? Someone once asked the 20th century atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell what he would say if he found himself standing before God on Judgment Day and God asked him, "Why didn't you believe in me?" Russell replied, "I would say, not enough evidence, God, not enough evidence." If you hang around skeptics or atheists long enough, you will hear the same response. People are open to believing in God if only there was enough evidence. And that is true. No one ought to believe anything on insufficient evidence, and sadly for the religious, they just don't have any. Now, they will claim that they do, but it's not the claim that matters, but the demonstration. And when the religious say they've got evidence, what they really mean is, well, we have stuff that we like. It gets them where they want to go, which isn't evidence, it's just confirmation bias. You don't start with the conclusion that you really want to reach and then work backward. You have to start with reality, which is the only thing that we've all concluded is actually there, and then follow the evidence from reality to make conclusions about the real world that fit and make sense. No, the religious don't do that. They start with the things they really want to believe are true and then say, well, how do we get back to that? Because they can't imagine that the things that they already accept on faith aren't real. This is where just about every single apologist goes wrong, and as we get further into this article, I have a feeling it's going to happen here again, because they just really want to believe. But as we're not starting with the same foregone conclusions, we are not going to take the, but it's just got to be true, as evidence of their claims. They've got to do better than that, and sadly, I think we all know they can't. It doesn't seem to matter how many times we explain the problems to them, they can't get past, but my faith. And this is why these conversations just don't go well. When your friend or family member asserts that there is no evidence for God, do not panic. Believe it or not, they have already taken an important first step. When someone wants proof or evidence before they accept a belief, that's commendable. It means they are not willing to believe something without support. And they shouldn't. Nobody should, but the religious seem willing to do so at the drop of a hat. Why? Because they aren't at all concerned with the facts. They just want the emotional comfort that they derive from their beliefs. Then they just can't imagine that everyone else isn't just like them, all fifis and no facts, so they just keep repeating the same old tired comforting ideas that they've already been told without realizing that we just don't care about that. We want to see what you can prove, not what you can claim. Now, it's good when the religious recognize that we aren't going to accept anything without corroboration. I mean, neither should they, but it's painfully obvious that they do. They just can't set aside their faith in order to evaluate the claims fairly and rationally. When I say that they don't care, I mean it. Somewhere deep down inside, they might realize that they should care, but when the rubber hits the road, they just don't. Their faith is far too important to them, and that's where they get into trouble. Trying to get them to acknowledge that's the real problem, isn't it? We should, however, clarify. What do they mean by evidence? Oftentimes, what people really want is scientific evidence. In the realm of science, evidence refers to data that you can see, hear, taste, touch, or smell, things that directly confirm or undermine a hypothesis. And in the context of science, such evidence has led to remarkable results. Just look at the advancements in technology and medicine. The problem is that scientific evidence, if you want to call it that, is all that really matters. If God is real, then God must be open to rational evaluation. We have never found a single thing that is demonstrably real that cannot be evaluated rationally. The religious, they just don't like that because they've made up an imaginary friend in their heads, and now they are trying to tell us that it's real without having any kind of evidence for it whatsoever. They just really want it to be real. How do they know any of that? Well, faith, of course, but faith means absolutely nothing. You can have faith that unicorns are real. Didn't Daniel King's daughter say that in a video a long time ago? That doesn't make them real, of course. It's why faith is such a complete waste of everyone's time. It doesn't matter what you want. It matters what you can prove, and the religious are desperate to avoid having to back up any of it objectively. You have to remember that because of their faith, they have lost any semblance of objectivity. They believe because they want to, not because they have any evidence to support it. How did they get to any of their beliefs? Well, it says so in a book, or their church told them it was true, or they were raised from a young age being told these stories. But absolutely none of that makes any of that stuff true. It's why we ask so many questions to get to the core of the matter. In fact, when we ask these questions, they tell us to stop asking because the questions themselves that we ask, they're uncomfortable. They don't want to think about it because thinking about it might make them start to ask questions of their own. And that's pretty dangerous when it comes to religion. It's why we can't stop. It is only through discomfort that they can ever find the truth. Not that they really seem to care. However, scientific evidence isn't the only type of evidence. Many truths that exist we cannot prove through physical evidence. For instance, we don't have physical evidence that life is meaningful or that murder is wrong. Of course, we understand these statements to be true, but not because we have found physical evidence to support them. We believe these truths on the basis of another sort of evidence. Except we can. What is meaningful is subjective. You make that up yourself. It has no intrinsic meaning. Murder is wrong because humans say that murder is wrong. There is no such thing as objective morality. This is where the religious consistently have problems because they can't separate what they want to be true from what is actually true. But I really like it doesn't matter, and that's what they have a problem with. We don't understand those statements to be true. We've just defined them that way in our heads. This is just bald-faced ignorance on display, and that is nothing to be proud of. The same holds for the existence of God. Whether you believe God exists or not, he is, by definition, immaterial and transcendent. Note, that is not how that works. A thing is a thing based on its own demonstrable existence, not something you just make up in your head. If I want to know what a cow looks like, I have to go look at a cow. If I want to know what a god looks like, then I need to be able to go look at a god. Otherwise, any attributes that I arbitrarily assign to it, they're just something that I made up. Now, the religious have been doing this for so long that I don't think they can understand the problem anymore. So let's continue and see it in action. He is immaterial because he's not composed of physical matter, not made of material stuff like you and me. And God is transcendent because he exists beyond space and time. But how do you know any of that? Not what do you believe, not what do you have faith in. How do you know that that is what your God is actually like? And more importantly, how do you prove it? Because this is where things get tricky. They really like these ideas because they've been thrown around for so many hundreds or thousands of years that none of them even question it anymore. And that's really the problem when you think about it, and why it is so important that we ask them these very, very simple questions. How do you know? Well, somebody I trust told me. Okay, how did they know? You need to go back and back and back until they realize that nobody actually knows anything. They believe it, they have faith in it, but they don't know. Nobody can know anything because no one has ever had a demonstrable experience with a verifiable God. Well, God just told them. Okay, how do you know that? How do you know they weren't just hearing voices? How do you know they didn't just make it up? Because if you can't answer those questions coherently, you're just wasting everybody's time. Thus, when we're searching for God, we do not expect to find direct physical scientific evidence for his existence within space and time. This fact is important. It is not just that we have not yet found such evidence, although it may exist. It is that such evidence is impossible, even in principle. We are not going to find one of God's hairs, or discover his footprint, or run a scientific experiment to see if he exists. Because that's how your religion has lied to you as a means of keeping you from actually caring about the truth. They are telling you stories that keep you filling the pews and filling the collection plates week after week after week. Because these are all the questions that I had to ask myself when I was deconverting. Where did this information come from, and how do I verify it? You can't. That's the problem. Well, it says so in the Bible. How did the people who wrote the Bible know that? God told them. Well, how do you know that? How do you know anything? Those are just meaningless stories that have been passed down for thousands and thousands of years, and they are not open to independent verification. How do you know? And if you realize that you don't, and that's the only answer if you're being honest with yourself, then your journey out of religion is just getting started. Does that mean it is impossible to demonstrate that God exists? No, it simply means that science is not the right means, just as a metal detector is not the right tool to find a wooden cup. We need other tools when exploring non-scientific questions. No, it does mean that it's impossible because demonstrating a real thing, and that's what the religious claim that God is, that does require objective, independent evidence that anyone can evaluate without having to hold all the corroborating beliefs and blind faith first. If you start out believing in a God, then inevitably you're going to see God in everything around you. That's exactly what the religious are doing. It's called confirmation bias. If you start with the belief that God done it, then everything is going to look to you just like God done it. That doesn't mean that God done it. And it's why the evidence has to stack up independently of the beliefs. Look at the trees is insanely common among the religious belief systems, yet they all insist that their own deity made the trees. Not the others, not the ones that other religions are claiming, only theirs. So how do we prove that it's your God that done it? Good question. They have no good answers. It always comes down to faith, and faith, as we keep saying, faith means nothing. Otherwise, every religion on the planet, every religion that has ever existed, every religion that will ever exist, all of them must be declared to be true just because all of them have had people who have had faith that they were. Your faith isn't special no matter how much you desperately wish it was. If you're going to be honest, and the religious rarely are, then you've got to be honest for everybody. What other tools are there besides science? One such tool is philosophy. Philosophy is concerned with life's most important issues, from morality to meaning to God. Philosophy allows us to probe realities that can't be detected through our senses. Thus, philosophy provides an excellent method to explore evidence for the existence of God. Except philosophy does not address reality. Sorry, it's conceptual, not physical. You cannot use philosophy to find anything useful about a new species of wombat. It is the wrong tool for the job for anything that you're claiming actually exists. Now, if the religious wanted to say that God is just a concept, fine, I'll agree. Philosophy is a fantastic tool for that, but that's not what they're saying. God isn't just something that lives in their heads. God is supposed to be something that exists in the real world, and we have only one reliable tool for anything that exists in verifiable reality or that interacts with verifiable reality, and that tool is science. In fact, the religious have spent centuries desperately trying to hide God from science. Yeah, look over there! Every time science comes to call. Why? Because they know that science isn't going to find what they desperately want to think is real, so they just make excuses for why science finds nothing, just to get away from the inevitable conclusion that there's no good reason to believe any gods are real in the first place. This is something they cannot accept, and the harder they fight to rationalize and make excuses, the more obvious it is that there's no reason to believe there are any gods out there. Gods are just imaginary. That's what every shred of evidence that we have points to. And it's too bad they'll never accept that, right? Philosophy typically offers evidence in the form of arguments. In fact, thinkers have identified no fewer than 20 arguments for God. Arguments that range from the clear and simple to the extremely complex. Some of these arguments appeal to the universe or history, others to the existence of reason and beauty. Except none of that is evidence. That's why they're called arguments, not evidence. This is another problem with the religious, who are just desperately looking for something to call evidence without actually having any evidence. Personal testimony isn't evidence. Philosophy isn't evidence. Only something that you can study independently of your beliefs is evidence, and the religious have none of that. Now, we've examined all the bog standard philosophical arguments for God, and every single one fails, almost always for the same reason. They are all some variation of, well, I don't get it, therefore God, where God is assumed to be the automatic answer to any question, and when they get stumped, they just slap a God label on it and call it a day. Now, in a second, we're going to see that in action, and I'm going to go into a lot of details on exactly where they get it all wrong. This can be applied to pretty much any so-called argument for God. None of them actually get to God. They just go on for a while and then just say, well, God did it. You can replace God with anything else you want, and it gives you the exact same result. The only way to prove God is to prove God. You can't say God done it without proving that God is real first, because you have to have a real cause, not just an asserted one. And then you have to produce a direct, demonstrable causal link between the event in question and the real God that you've already proven. That's it. Otherwise, you're just wasting your time, and wow, do the religious waste a lot of time. So let's see an example of that coming up shortly. We can approach the God question from many angles, and there is no one best way. However, in this short essay, we are going to look at one of the arguments that I find to be the strongest. The problem is, you can't. Every single angle that they try, that they've ever tried, they are all logically fallacious, which you would think that the so-called philosophers among them would actually understand. But they are entirely blinded when it comes to their faith. there has never been a single convincing argument or claim made for the existence of God, at least as far as I'm concerned, because all of them simply assume the existence of their gods without actually demonstrating the existence of their gods. Assuming things doesn't mean anything. Asserting things doesn't mean anything. You actually have to be able to back it up in a way that I, who am currently not convinced that any of your beliefs are true, can actually accept. I am not biased against your beliefs, I'm just not convinced by them, and the complete inability of the religious to demonstrate any of it, that's just not helping their case. In fact, it just makes them look incompetent. So here comes the example. We're going to do a very deep dive. A strong argument for God. Before we begin, I want to note that if terms like arguments or evidence disconcert you, you might instead consider these arguments as clues that converge and point to a common conclusion, much the way that road signs guide you to a specific destination. A sign doesn't prove that the destination exists, but it does point the way. These arguments are a signpost for God. So let us look at one signpost that, in my opinion, presents perhaps the simplest yet most powerful argument for God's existence. I'm sorry, but if arguments and evidence bothers you, then you've got no business believing any of this stuff because you are terminally stupid. Now, I had just this exact conversation with a theist who said that if I couldn't prove him wrong, then he will continue to believe that he's right because it's my job to prove that God isn't real, not his job to prove that it is. Really, what can you say to that? Because it's just so painfully stupid and irrational that it warrants no real examination on my side. Ultimately, it went nowhere because for everything that I said, his response was effectively, "But God is real, so I'm right." And I just got bored and went somewhere else. My time is a lot more valuable than that. Sadly, that is how most Christians actually operate. They are automatically right because they want to be. Everyone who disagrees with them is automatically wrong because they don't like it. And there's no coherent conversation actually going on. So let's get to his example, because it is not good. The Kalam argument dates back to the Middle Ages, but is made popular today by William Lane Craig, an evangelical Christian philosopher. But the problem is, Craig is an idiot. Like most theists, Craig just wants it to be true, and since he's starting with that conclusion, about which he simply cannot be wrong, he is just jumping to the end result that, of course, he was right all along, without logically proving, well, anything. As I will point out, the Kalam has a lot of problems, the biggest among which is that it doesn't even mention God. It doesn't even attempt to demonstrate God. It doesn't try to link to the Christian God or any other God. It just assumes, well, of course it's God, and just runs around with the goalposts. But that is not impressive. Yet it doesn't matter how many times we point this out to them, they just keep doing it, because they don't really care about the truth. The argument is very simple. In fact, it is probably the easiest of all the arguments to memorize, having two premises and one conclusion. Premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, the universe has a cause. If you can memorize these three simple statements, you will be well equipped when dialoguing with a skeptic. Yeah, it's clear that this guy is used to talking to idiots, and maybe that's why he thinks that his discussion project is actually working out for the religious. This is kind of like STR, where they're really convinced that their arguments are strong, and then they tell all of their students that, yeah, these aren't going to work very often, are they? Because the one thing that they never want to do is talk to somebody who actually has a clue. Now, we've done Kalam to death, and sorry, but we're going to do it again. This time, we're going to point out every single problem that I can see with the religious playbook, and sorry, but I'm probably going to miss some. If you see any that I don't mention, make sure you bring it up down in the comments below. This isn't going to be exhaustive because our theists, they're not being exhaustive, but at least we're going to try. So I think that's where we're going to stop for the day, just before he gets into his explanations for his premises, because this is going to get really, really, really long if we don't. Next week, we'll just wrap this up with an in-depth look at why all of his claims go absolutely nowhere, which I suppose we all expect. But this is really an example of why the religious don't get on well with the non-religious. We can see right through all of their fallacious behavior, and they sadly can't. They are starting with those emotionally comforting premises that they just happen to like, and really can't understand why everybody else isn't on board, and they're not really open to any explanations that don't include, well, of course we believe, hallelujah. That's the difference. They are looking for belief. They're looking for faith. We are looking for evidence. Our epistemological standards are entirely different from theirs, and ours just so happen to be rational. Theirs aren't. So we'll be back in a week to finish this up, but I don't think it's going to get any better once they get down to the nitty-gritty. I mean, don't get your hopes up. Stay safe and sane until then, because I'm sure we're going to get a huge laugh.